On a quiet street in Park City, Kansas, in the early morning hours of February 25th, 2005, a seemingly ordinary man was pulled over by police. Dennis Rader, 59 years old, was driving home from work when multiple squad cars surrounded his vehicle. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply sat there, calm and composed, as officers placed him under arrest. What the community didn't know was that they had just witnessed the capture of one of America's most notorious serial killers. For over 3 decades, Dennis Rader had lived a double life so perfectly crafted that even his own family had no idea who he really was. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9th, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of 4 sons. On the surface, his childhood appeared unremarkable, or almost mundane. His father served in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II before working for the Kansas Electric Utility. The family attended Lutheran church regularly. Dennis joined the Boy Scouts and participated in community activities. He was an average student at Riverview Elementary School, perhaps a bit introverted and withdrawn, but nothing that raised serious alarm bells. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, something dark was already taking root. Even as a child, Dennis exhibited disturbing behaviors that would later prove to be early warning signs of the monster he would become. He reportedly hung stray animals, a chilling precursor to the violence that would define his adult life. By his own admission, fantasies of domination, bondage, and torture began consuming his thoughts while he was still in grade school. These weren't fleeting childhood curiosities. They were the foundation of a twisted psychology that would eventually claim 10 innocent lives. Dr. Tony Rourke, a forensic psychologist who later evaluated Rader, believed that something catastrophic happened early in Dennis's life to spawn what would become the BTK Killer. The exact trigger remains unknown, but the result was unmistakable. As Rader himself would later describe it, his mind became fixated on bondage in what he called damsels in distress. He was fascinated by the concept of the white hat versus the black hat, good versus evil, but in his warped worldview, he had chosen to embrace the darkness. The story of Dennis Rader isn't one of a normal youth corrupted by external influences. This was a person who was emotionally and psychologically different from the very beginning. Like a worm growing inside a flower, his darkness developed quietly, hidden beneath the facade of a typical Midwestern boy. While other children played games and formed friendships, Dennis was cultivating violent sexual fantasies that would eventually manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. In the 1960s, Rader enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, serving his country while secretly harboring thoughts that would have terrified his fellow servicemen. Military discipline and structure couldn't suppress the demons that were growing stronger inside him. When he completed his service and returned to Wichita in 1970, he appeared to be following the American dream. He married Paula Dietz on May 22nd, 1971, and they would go on to have 2 children together, Carrie and Brian. To everyone who knew him, Dennis Rader seemed like the perfect family man. He pursued his education with determination, earning an associate degree in electronics engineering from Butler County Community College in El Dorado in 1973. He didn't stop there. He continued his studies at Wichita State University, graduating in 1979 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Administration of Justice. The irony was profound. Here was a man studying criminal justice while planning to become one of the most prolific serial killers in Kansas history. Rader's professional life appeared equally stable and respectable. He worked various jobs, including a brief stint as a factory worker for the Coleman Company, a maker of camping equipment. In 1974, he began working for ADT Security Services, where he would remain until 1988. His job involved installing security alarms in homes throughout the Wichita area. The cruel irony wasn't lost on investigators later. Many of his clients were homeowners seeking protection from the very crimes he was committing. They were paying him to secure their homes against BTK, never knowing that BTK was standing in their living rooms, learning the layout of their houses, studying their routines. In 1991, Rader transitioned to a new role as a compliance officer in Park City, Kansas. This position gave him authority and respect in the community. He was known for being meticulous, perhaps overly so, about code enforcement and regulations. Neighbors would later recall how seriously he took his job, how he would cite people for the smallest infractions. What they didn't realize was that this obsession with control and rules was a reflection of the same personality traits that drove him to commit murder. But it was Rader's involvement in his church and community that created the most chilling contrast to his secret life. He was an active member of Christ Lutheran Church, eventually serving as president of the congregation. He participated in church activities, attended services regularly, and presented himself as a devout Christian. The man who stood before his fellow parishioners, reading scripture and leading prayers, was the same man who was methodically planning and executing brutal murders. This double life wasn't accidental. It was carefully constructed and maintained with the precision of a master manipulator. Dennis Rader understood that the best way to hide in plain sight was to become someone people trusted, someone they looked up to. He created a persona so convincing that even those closest to him never suspected the truth. His wife Paula lived with him for decades without knowing what he was capable of. His children grew up loving a father who was secretly one of America's most dangerous predators. The psychological profile that emerged from years of study revealed a man who exhibited classic signs of psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. But unlike many serial killers who struggle to maintain normal relationships and employment, Rader excelled at compartmentalization. He could switch between his roles as husband, father, church leader, and killer with frightening ease. Behind closed doors, Rader satisfied his violent urges through elaborate fantasy rituals. He would spend hours engaging in what he called autoerotic activities, using photographs, magazine clippings, and personal items stolen from his victims to relive his crimes. He created detailed scenarios in his mind, playing out his murders over and over again. These fantasies served as a release valve, allowing him to delay his compulsion to kill for months or even years at a time. But the pressure was always building. The fantasies could only satisfy him for so long before the urge to kill again became overwhelming. And when that happened, Dennis Rader would begin the process that had become as familiar to him as his daily routine. He would start trolling, as he called it, driving through neighborhoods, walking past schools and shopping centers, looking for the perfect victim. He had a type. Rader was particularly drawn to women, often focusing on those he perceived as vulnerable or isolated. He would study their routines, learn their schedules, and plan his attacks with military precision. He gathered what he called his hit kit, a collection of tools and weapons that included guns, knives, rope, tape, plastic bags, and various implements for breaking and entering. Everything was organized, everything was planned, everything was designed to give him maximum control over his victims. The transformation from Dennis Rader, respected community member, to BTK, cold-blooded killer, was complete. By 1974, he was ready to act on the violent fantasies that had consumed his thoughts for decades. He had trained himself to kill. He had learned to tie knots and nooses. He had studied the vulnerabilities of his chosen hunting ground. The only question that remained was when and where he would strike first. What happened next would terrorize the city of Wichita for the next 3 decades and established Dennis Rader as one of the most calculating and ruthless serial killers in American history. The man who appeared so normal, so trustworthy, so ordinary, was about to reveal the true extent of the darkness that had been growing inside him since childhood. The BTK Killer was born, and Wichita would never be the same. The winter morning of January 15th, 1974, started like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Wichita, Kansas. Children were getting ready for school, parents were heading to work, and the Otero family was beginning what they believed would be another ordinary day. Joseph Otero Sr., a 38-year-old Air Force veteran, his wife, Julie, 33, and their children were unaware that they had been watched, studied, and selected by someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. Dennis Rader had been stalking the Otero family with the methodical precision of a predator. He was particularly drawn to Julie Otero and her 11-year-old daughter, Josephine, admiring what he described as their beautiful brown skin and dark hair. For weeks, he had observed their routines, learning when the older children left for school, when Joseph went to work, and when the family would be most vulnerable. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was calculated, planned, and executed with terrifying efficiency. On that fateful morning, Rader gathered what he called his hit kit, a carefully assembled collection of tools that revealed the depth of his preparation. The kit contained a gun, knives, hoods, cords, tape, plastic bags, gloves, and various implements for breaking and entering. Each item had been selected for a specific purpose in the nightmare he was about to unleash. By 8:20 a.m., he could wait no longer. The compulsion that had been building inside him for months had reached its breaking point. Rader approached the Otero home with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. He scaled the backyard fence and methodically cut the telephone lines, ensuring the family would be unable to call for help. This single act demonstrated his understanding of how to isolate his victims and maintain control over the situation. He had studied not just the family, but the mechanics of murder itself, learning to tie knots and nooses, understanding how to kill while avoiding detection. When Rader entered the Otero home, he encountered the entire family. Joseph Sr. was there, along with Julie and 2 of their younger children, 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josephine. What followed was a scene of such calculated brutality that it would haunt investigators for decades. Rader held the family at gunpoint, forcing them to comply with his demands. He bound each family member with cords, demonstrating the elaborate knot-tying skills he had practiced in preparation for this moment. The murders themselves were methodical and cruel. Rader strangled each victim, taking his time with the process, savoring the control he had over their lives. Young Josephine, the primary object of his obsession, was hanged in the basement. The positioning of the bodies, the careful attention to the binding, and the clinical nature of the killings all pointed to someone who was fulfilling a long-held fantasy rather than acting in a moment of rage or desperation. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of semen at the crime scene, though none of the victims had been sexually assaulted. This detail would become a crucial piece of evidence decades later, but at the time it simply added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. The murders weren't about sexual gratification in the traditional sense, but about power, control, and the fulfillment of violent fantasies that had been festering in Rader's mind since childhood. The 3 older Otero children returned from school that afternoon to discover a scene that would traumatize them for life. The bodies of their parents and siblings were found throughout the house, each positioned in a way that suggested the killer had taken time to arrange them. The methodical nature of the crime scene spoke to a perpetrator who was organized, patient, and utterly without remorse. The impact on the Wichita community was immediate and profound. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a domestic dispute that had escalated. This was the work of someone who had killed an entire family for reasons that seemed to make no sense to anyone except the killer himself. The randomness of the selection, combined with the brutal efficiency of the execution, created a sense of terror that would grip the city for decades. What made the Otero murders particularly chilling was how they fit into Rader's larger pattern of behavior. This wasn't his first crime, nor would it be his last. The skills he demonstrated, the planning involved, and the calm execution all suggested someone who had been building toward this moment for years. The fantasy had finally become reality, and the results were more horrific than anyone could have imagined. The investigation that followed would consume the Wichita Police Department for years. The crime scene yielded few clues beyond the physical evidence of the murders themselves. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, and no obvious connection between the killer and the victims. The Otero family had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, selected by a predator who saw them as objects to fulfill his violent fantasies. But Dennis Rader wasn't content to simply kill and disappear. The murders were only the beginning of a campaign of terror that would span decades. The need for recognition, for acknowledgement of his crimes, would eventually drive him to reach out to the media and police. He wanted the world to know what he had done, to understand the power he wielded over life and death. The Otero murders marked the beginning of what would become known as the BTK killing spree, named after Rader's own description of his methods: bind or torture, kill. These three words would become synonymous with terror in Wichita, representing not just a series of crimes, but a fundamental challenge to the community's sense of safety and security. As investigators worked to piece together what had happened in the Otero home, they had no way of knowing that they were dealing with someone who would continue killing for decades, someone who would taunt them with letters and phone calls, someone who would become one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. The quiet family man who installed security systems by day and attended the church regularly had successfully hidden his true nature from everyone around him. The Otero murders were just the beginning of Dennis Rader's reign of terror, but they established the pattern that would define his crimes for the next 3 decades. The careful planning, the binding of victims, the psychological torture, and the ultimate act of murder would be repeated again and again, each time with the same methodical precision that had characterized that terrible morning in January 1974. The letters kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last, each one proving that the monster who had slaughtered the Otero family was still out there, still watching, still planning. BTK wasn't finished. He was just getting started. In April 1974, just 3 months after the Otero murders, Rader struck again. This time, his target was Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman who worked at the same Coleman company where Julie Otero had been employed. It wasn't a coincidence. Rader had been watching her, studying her routines, feeding his obsession. He broke into her home on East 13th Street, expecting to find her alone. But when Catherine arrived, she wasn't by herself. Her brother Kevin was with her. What followed was chaos. Rader's meticulous planning crumbled in an instant. Kevin fought back, struggling with the intruder as Catherine screamed. In the violent struggle, Rader shot Kevin twice, but somehow, miraculously, Kevin managed to escape. He stumbled out of the house, bleeding and desperate, and flagged down a passing car. But his escape came at a terrible cost. While Kevin fought for his life outside, Rader turned his full attention to Catherine. He bound her, tortured her, and then stabbed her multiple times before fleeing the scene. Catherine Bright died that day, but her brother's survival was a nightmare scenario for Rader. For the first time, there was a witness. Kevin could describe the attacker, could put a face to the monster, but Kevin's trauma was so severe, his memories so fractured by shock and blood loss, that his description was vague. Medium height, average build, nothing that would lead police to Dennis Rader, the quiet family man who installed security systems for ADT. The irony was sickening. By day, Rader was installing alarm systems and security equipment for terrified Wichita residents who were desperate to protect themselves from BTK. By night, he was the very predator they were trying to keep out. He knew their homes, their layouts, their vulnerabilities. He had access to their most private spaces, their sense of security, their trust, and he used every bit of that knowledge to hunt them. The killing didn't stop. In March 1977, Rader targeted Shirley Vian, a 26-year-old mother of 3 young children. He had been watching her home, learning her patterns, waiting for the perfect moment. When he struck, it was as he forced his way inside and found Shirley with her children. What happened next revealed the true depths of his depravity. Rader didn't just kill Shirley, he made her children watch as he bound their mother. He locked them in the bathroom, telling them to stay quiet while he tortured and strangled their mother in the next room. The children survived, but they were left with scars that would never heal. They had looked into the face of pure evil and lived to tell about it. But even their testimony couldn't lead police to Rader. He was too careful, too methodical, too good at blending into the fabric of ordinary life. By December 1977, Rader was growing frustrated. The media attention was dying down. The panic was fading. People were starting to forget about BTK, and that was unacceptable. He needed the spotlight, craved the fear and recognition that came with it. So he killed again, this time targeting Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman who lived alone. After strangling her, he did something that would become his signature move. He called the police from a payphone and calmly reported his own crime. "Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Nancy Fox." Then he hung up. The call was brief, matter-of-fact, almost businesslike. But it sent shockwaves through the Wichita Police Department. The killer wasn't just murdering people. He was taunting them, playing games, treating their investigation like his personal entertainment. And then came the letter that would cement his place in criminal history. In early 1998, Rader sent a letter to KKTV, a local television station. The letter was typed, methodical, and chilling in its casual tone. "I find the newspaper not writing about the poem on Vian unsatisfying," he wrote. A little paragraph would have been enough. "I know it is not the media's fault. The police chief, he keeps things quiet and doesn't let the public know there is a psycho running around loose strangling mostly women. There are a few men thrown in also." But it was the next part of the letter that would give him his infamous name. "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK." You see, he added again. They will be on the next victim. BTK, bind, torture, kill. 3 words that perfectly encapsulated his method, his madness, his complete lack of humanity. He had given himself a brand, a calling card that would strike fear into the hearts of anyone who heard it. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone who took pride in his work, who wanted credit for his crimes, who saw murder as an art form. The letter continued, and with each word, the true extent of his narcissism became clear. "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" he demanded. "Do the cop really think that someone is hot on my trail? Ha ha, they haven't got near me. It is hard to talk with someone about this. This is about the only way to put the subject down." He was complaining, actually complaining, that he wasn't getting enough media coverage for his murders. In his twisted mind, he was performing a service, creating entertainment giving the public something to talk about. And he was frustrated that his efforts weren't being properly appreciated. The letter also revealed something else about Rader's psychology. He claimed to be driven by what he called Factor X, a mysterious force that he said also motivated other notorious killers like Jack the Ripper and the son of Sam. It was his way of distancing himself from responsibility, of making his crimes seem like the work of some supernatural influence rather than his own deliberate choices. When this monster enter my brain, I will never know. But it here to stay, he wrote. How does one cure himself? If you ask for help that you have killed and stalked, you sure would not get help. You would be placed in a nut house or prison. So this monster is on the loose, and he has a great thirst for blood. This wasn't a cry for help. This was a manifesto. Rader was explaining his worldview, his philosophy, his complete disconnection from normal human emotion. He wasn't asking to be stopped. He was asking to be understood, to be recognized, to be feared. The most disturbing part of the letter was how calculated it was. Every word was chosen deliberately. Every sentence was crafted to maximize impact. This wasn't the rambling of a madman. This was the careful communication of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and took pride in doing it well. Police studied the letter obsessively, looking for clues, for patterns, for anything that might lead them to the killer. But Rader had been careful. The letter was typed on a generic typewriter. The paper was common. The envelope gave no hints about its origin. He had mailed it from a location far from his home, far from his work, far from anywhere that could be connected to Dennis Rader. And then, just as suddenly as the killing spree had begun, it stopped. After Nancy Fox's murder in December 1977, BTK seemed to vanish. No more bodies, no more letters, no more taunting phone calls. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. The silence was almost worse than the killing. At least when he was active, police knew what they were dealing with. They could follow leads, investigate crime scenes, interview witnesses. But this silence left them with nothing. No new evidence, no fresh leads, no way to move forward. The case went cold, and the people of Wichita were left to wonder, was BTK dead? Had he been arrested for another crime? Had he simply moved on to terrorize another city? The truth was far more mundane and far more terrifying. Dennis Rader hadn't gone anywhere. He was still in Wichita, still living his double life, still working at ADT, still going to church, still playing the role of devoted husband and father. The only thing that had changed was his circumstances. His life had become more demanding, more complicated, more difficult to manage alongside his murderous hobbies. By 1979, Rader had graduated from Wichita State University with a degree in criminal justice. The irony was staggering. He had literally studied the very system that was trying to catch him, learned about investigative techniques, forensic science, criminal psychology. He knew how police thought, how they worked, how they could be fooled. His education had made him a more dangerous killer, not a reformed one, but education also meant new responsibilities. He was working full-time, managing a household, raising children. His wife Paula was becoming more attentive, more curious about his whereabouts. His children were getting older, more aware of their father's behavior. The elaborate planning and preparation that his murders required was becoming harder to hide, harder to explain away. So Rader adapted. He didn't stop being BTK. He simply found new ways to satisfy his urges without the risk of actually killing. He developed what he called his projects, elaborate fantasy scenarios that he would play out in private. He would dress up dolls in clothing stolen from his victims, photograph them in bondage positions, create detailed drawings of imaginary murders. He would masturbate to these fantasies, using them to relive his crimes over and over again. These projects served as a pressure valve, a way to manage his compulsions without exposing himself to the risk of another murder. But they also revealed the true nature of his crimes. This wasn't about anger or revenge or even sexual gratification in the traditional sense. This was about power, about control, about the ability to reduce another human being to an object for his amusement. The dolls, the drawings, the photographs, they were all about possession. In his mind, his victims belonged to him forever. Death was just at the beginning of their relationship. Through his projects, he could continue to torture them, to humiliate them, to control them long after their bodies had been buried. And still, no one suspected. Dennis Rader continued to be seen as a model citizen, a dedicated employee, a loving family man. He was active in his church, served on community boards, helped his neighbors with their problems. He was the kind of person people trusted, the kind of person who could walk into your home to install a security system and never be seen as a threat. The disconnect was absolute. By day, he was Dennis Rader, protector and provider. By night, he was Body K, predator and killer. And somehow, impossibly, he managed to keep these two identities completely separate. It was a level of compartmentalization that defied understanding, a psychological feat that would fascinate criminal psychologists for decades to come. But the silence wouldn't last forever. The monster inside Dennis Rader was patient, but it was never satisfied. It was always hungry, always waiting, always ready to strike again. And when it finally did, after years of dormancy, it would be more vicious, more calculated, and more terrifying than ever before. The people of Wichita thought BTK was gone. They had no idea that their nightmare was just beginning. The aftermath of BTK's killing spree didn't bring immediate peace to Wichita. The silence that followed his 1979 murder of Maureen Hedge was almost more terrifying than the violence itself. For the residents of this Kansas city, every quiet day brought a new question. Was he gone, or was he simply waiting? The investigation continued, but leads grew cold. Files gathered dust. The case that had consumed the police department for half a decade seemed to slip into the shadows, becoming another unsolved mystery that haunted the corridors of law enforcement. But Dennis Rader wasn't gone. He was simply evolving, adapting, learning to live with the monster inside him while maintaining the facade that had protected him for so long. The man who had terrorized an entire city was now focused on something else entirely, building the perfect life. In 1979, the same year he killed Maureen Hedge, Rader graduated from Wichita State University with a bachelor's degree in administration of justice. The irony was suffocating. Here was a man who had spent years studying the very system designed to catch him, all while perfecting his ability to evade it. His graduation wasn't just an academic achievement, it was a calculated move. Rader understood that knowledge was power, and understanding the criminal justice system from the inside gave him advantages that most killers could never dream of. He knew how investigations worked, how evidence was processed, how behavioral profiles were constructed. Every textbook he read, every lecture he attended, every exam he passed was another layer of protection against the day someone might come looking for him. The transition from active killer to dormant predator wasn't immediate. Throughout the early 1980s, Rader struggled with what he called his demon. The urge to kill didn't disappear, it simply transformed. He developed elaborate coping mechanisms, twisted rituals that allowed him to feed his dark fantasies without crossing the line into actual murder. He would drive through neighborhoods at night, selecting potential victims, planning hypothetical attacks down to the smallest detail. He kept detailed journals of these fantasies, complete with sketches and diagrams. His work at ADOT Security Services provided the perfect cover for this behavior. As a security technician, Rader had legitimate reasons to be in people's homes, to study their routines, to understand their vulnerabilities. He would install alarm systems during the day, then return at night to test their weaknesses. Many of his clients were women living alone, homeowners who had called ADT specifically because they were afraid of the BTK Killer. The cruel irony was that they were inviting their greatest fear directly into their homes. Rader's colleagues at ADT described him as professional, reliable, and knowledgeable. He was the kind of employee who showed up on time, did his job without complaint, and never caused problems. But what they didn't know was that he was using his position to conduct surveillance on potential victims. He would note which houses had good hiding spots, which had multiple entry points, which had occupants who followed predictable schedules. He was building a mental database of targets, even if he never intended to act on most of them. The fantasies became more sophisticated over time. Rader would create elaborate scenarios in his mind, complete with costumes, props, and detailed scripts. He collected photographs from magazines, cutting out images of women who reminded him of his victims or potential targets. He would arrange these images in specific patterns, creating what he called projects, twisted photo montages that allowed him to relive his crimes and plan new ones. His home life during this period was a masterclass in compartmentalization. Paula Dietz, his wife, later claimed she had no idea about his dark side. To her, Dennis was a devoted husband and father who worked hard to provide for his family. He attended church regularly, participated in community activities, and seemed to embody the values of middle-class American life. Their children, Carrie and Brian, grew up believing their father was a normal, loving parent who happened to work in home security. But there were signs, subtle indicators that something wasn't quite right. Rader had strict rules about certain areas of the house that were off-limits to his family. He had a workshop in the basement where he claimed to work on various projects, but family members were never allowed inside. He would disappear for hours at a time, claiming to be working late or attending meetings. He had an unusual interest in knots and rope work, which he explained as a hobby related to his Boy Scout leadership activities. The Boy Scouts provided another perfect cover for Rader's darker impulses. As a scout leader, he had access to children and teenagers, and he was trusted by parents throughout the community. He taught knot-tying classes, organized camping trips, and helped young people earn merit badges. On the surface, he appeared to be a pillar of the community, someone who was dedicated to helping children develop character and life skills. But even within the Scouts, there were subtle signs of his true nature. Rader had an unusual fascination with discipline and control. He was stricter than other leaders, more demanding, more focused on absolute obedience. He would sometimes make comments that seemed inappropriate, jokes that pushed boundaries, observations about the Scouts that made other adults uncomfortable. Nothing that would raise serious red flags, but enough to make some people feel uneasy around him. The church provided yet another layer of respectability. Rader was an active member of Christ Lutheran Church, where he served in various leadership roles over the years. He read scripture during services, helped with community outreach programs, and eventually became the congregation council president. To his fellow parishioners, he was a model Christian, someone who took his faith seriously and lived according to its principles. The contradiction between his public persona and his private thoughts was staggering. Here was a man who could stand in front of a congregation and read about love, forgiveness, and redemption, all while harboring fantasies about torture and murder. He could lead prayers for peace and safety while mentally planning attacks on innocent people. He could counsel troubled youth while secretly reliving the moments when he had strangled children their age. In 1991, after more than a decade of dormancy, the demon finally broke free again. Rader's final known victim was Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old grandmother who lived alone in a house on the outskirts of Wichita. The attack followed his familiar pattern. He entered her home, bound and strangled her, then disposed of her body in a remote location. But there was something different about this murder, something that suggested Rader was struggling to maintain control over his impulses. The Davis murder was messier than his previous crimes, less organized, more impulsive. It was as if the long period of suppression had created a pressure that finally exploded in a burst of violence. After killing Davis, Rader moved her body to a bridge, where he posed it in a grotesque display, taking photographs that he would later use to relive the experience. The crime scene showed signs of ritualistic behavior, suggesting that his fantasies had become more elaborate and more twisted during his years of forced restraint. Following the Davis murder, Rader once again retreated into his double life. But this time, the retreat felt different. He was older now, more settled in his routines, more confident in his ability to maintain his facade. He had survived more than a decade without killing, proving to himself that he could control his urges when necessary. The murder of Dolores Davis felt like a release valve, a way to relieve the pressure that had been building for years. Throughout the 1990s, Rader continued to live his double life with remarkable success. He left ADT and took a job as a compliance officer for Park City, a small municipality near Wichita. In this role, he was responsible for enforcing local ordinances, measuring grass heights, checking for code violations, and issuing citations for various infractions. It was a position that gave him authority over his neighbors, the power to enter their properties and inspect their homes. His work as a compliance officer revealed another aspect of his personality, his obsession with rules and control. Rader was notoriously strict in his enforcement of city codes, earning a reputation as someone who would cite residents for the smallest infractions. He would measure grass to the exact inch, photograph minor violations, and pursue enforcement actions with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the crimes. Some residents complained that he seemed to enjoy wielding power over them, that he took pleasure in their discomfort when he issued citations. This behavior was consistent with his psychological profile. Rader had always been driven by a need for control and dominance, and his job as a compliance officer provided a legal outlet for these impulses. He could intimidate people, invade their privacy, and force them to comply with his demands, all under the authority of local government. It was a way to satisfy his power fantasies without crossing the line into criminal behavior. The years passed quietly. Rader aged. His children grew up and moved away. His hair turned gray, and his body began to show the signs of middle age. To all outward appearances, he had become a harmless bureaucrat, a slightly overzealous city employee who took his job too seriously. The BTK Killer seemed like a distant memory, a boogeyman from Wichita's past that had faded into local folklore. But inside Dennis Rader, the demon was still alive, still waiting, still hungry for the recognition and fear that had once made him feel powerful. The long period of dormancy hadn't killed his darker impulses. It had simply taught him patience. He had learned to wait, to plan, to savor the anticipation of his next opportunity to strike. And as the years passed, that opportunity would eventually come, triggered by an anniversary that would awaken the sleeping monster and set in motion the events that would finally bring Dennis Rader's reign of terror to an end. The quiet years had been a deception. a carefully constructed illusion that masked the true nature of the man who continued to live among the people of Wichita. BTK wasn't gone. He was simply biding his time, waiting for the right moment to remind the world that some demons never truly sleep, as they just learn to hide better. The letters kept coming, package after package, taunting message after taunting message. For over a year following his resurgence in 2004, Dennis Rader couldn't resist the spotlight he'd craved for so long. He was no longer the patient, methodical killer who could disappear for decades. He was a man desperate for recognition, and that desperation would become his downfall. Each communication grew bolder, more revealing. He sent detailed drawings of his victims, photographs he'd taken of their bodies, and even dolls posed to mimic their final moments. The cereal boxes became his signature delivery method, a twisted reference to his identity as a serial killer. Inside these boxes, investigators found crime scene photos, copies of driver's licenses, and handwritten descriptions of murders that had haunted Wichita for 30 years. The media coverage was exactly what Rader wanted. Fear gripped the city once again. People who had lived through the original BTK terror in the 70s and 80s suddenly found themselves checking their locks twice, avoiding dark parking lots, remembering the nightmare they thought had ended. But this time, law enforcement was ready. They had better technology, better training, and most importantly, they had learned from the mistakes of the past. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr led the BTK task force with a methodical approach that matched Rader's own calculated methods. Every piece of evidence was analyzed, every communication studied for clues. The team knew they were dealing with someone who understood police procedures, someone who had been watching and learning for decades. But they also recognized something else in these new communications. There was an arrogance, a cockiness that hadn't been there before. This wasn't the careful, patient killer of the past. This was someone who believed he was untouchable. The breakthrough came in February 2005, when Rader made the mistake that would end his reign of terror. In one of his communications, he asked police a simple question. Could they trace a floppy disk back to him if he sent one? The question itself revealed his desperation for continued contact. He wanted to keep playing the game, but he needed assurance that he could do so safely. The police response was brilliant in its simplicity. They placed a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle, answering his question with a lie. They told him it would be safe to send the disc. They knew he would be watching, knew he would see their response, and they were right. Within days, a purple floppy disk arrived at KSAS television station, hidden inside a cereal box, along with a letter and an index card. The disk contained what appeared to be a simple text document, but forensic computer analyst Randy Stone knew better. Every digital file contains metadata, invisible information that reveals when it was created, when it was last modified, and crucially, what computer was used to create it. When Stone examined the disk, he found exactly what he was looking for. The document had been last modified by someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. It took less than 30 seconds to connect the dots. A quick internet search revealed that Dennis Rader was not only a member of Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas, but served as its president. The man who had terrorized Wichita for decades, who had taunted police with his superior knowledge and careful planning, had been undone by technology he didn't understand and arrogance he couldn't control. But the investigators weren't ready to move yet. They needed more than metadata to build a case. They needed physical evidence, and they found it in the most unlikely place. DNA evidence from the original crime scenes had been carefully preserved for over 30 years. Now they needed a sample from Dennis Rader to compare it against. They couldn't simply ask him for a sample without revealing their hand, so they devised a plan that was both brilliant and morally questionable. Rader's daughter, Carrie, had recently undergone a medical procedure at a local hospital. The investigators approached the hospital and requested her DNA sample, knowing that a child's DNA would be close enough to her father's to establish a familial match. When they compared Carrie's DNA to the evidence from the BTK crime scenes, they found what they were looking for. The match was conclusive. Dennis Rader was BTK. On February 25th, in 2005, Dennis Rader was driving home for lunch when he noticed the police cars following him. He pulled over without resistance, perhaps knowing that his decades-long game had finally come to an end. The man who had killed 10 people, terrorized a city, and evaded capture for over 30 years was arrested in broad daylight on a suburban street, looking like nothing more than an ordinary middle-aged man having a bad day. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community that had known Rader as a neighbor, a church leader, and a compliance officer. Paula Rader, his wife of 34 years, was devastated. She had lived with a monster for decades without knowing it. Their children, Brian and Carrie, struggled to reconcile the father they knew with the killer he had been. The congregation at Christ Lutheran Church, where Rader had served as president and been trusted with the spiritual welfare of the community, felt betrayed and violated. During his interrogation, Rader showed no remorse. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk about his crimes openly. He described his murders in clinical detail, referring to his victims by number rather than name. He explained his methods, his motivations, and his long periods of dormancy with the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to discuss the weather. When asked about his feelings toward his victims, he showed no emotion whatsoever. The psychological evaluation that followed revealed a man who had managed to compartmentalize his life so completely that he genuinely seemed to believe he was two different people. There was Dennis Rader, the family man and community leader, and there was BTK's, the killer who bound, tortured, and murdered innocent people. He had lived this double life for so long that it had become natural to him, effortless even. The evidence against Rader was overwhelming. The DNA match, the metadata from the floppy disk, the detailed knowledge of the crime scenes, and eventually his own confessions left no doubt about his guilt. But perhaps the most damning evidence was his collection of trophies. When police searched his home, they found a horrifying museum of murder. Driver's licenses, jewelry, photographs, and personal items from his victims were carefully cataloged and stored. He had kept pieces of their lives as souvenirs, mementos of his power over them. The trial was a formality. Faced with insurmountable evidence, Rader agreed to plead guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. But the plea hearing became something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Instead of showing remorse, Rader used the opportunity to relive his crimes in excruciating detail. He described each murder methodically, clinically, as if he were reading from a technical manual. He told the court about the Otero family, about little Josephine's final moments, about the sounds his victims made as they died. He explained his methods, his planning, his ritual of taking photographs and stealing personal items. The families of his victims sat in the courtroom, forced to listen to the man who had destroyed their lives, describe their loved ones' final moments with the emotional investment of someone describing a grocery list. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to the community that had lived in fear for so long. Judge Gregory Waller sentenced Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison, and Kansas would be safe from BTK forever. but the damage he had done extended far beyond his 10 victims. He had shattered the sense of security that people take for granted, had shown that evil could hide behind the most ordinary facade. Dennis Rader's story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can be the neighbor who waves from across the street, the church leader who volunteers at community events, the compliance officer who enforces local ordinances. They can live among us for decades, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. And sometimes, the scariest part of all is that they never reveal it. They simply continue living their double lives, keeping their darkness carefully contained until something finally brings them into the light. The investigation into BTK had reached a critical juncture. For over 30 years, Dennis Rader had managed to evade capture, slipping through the fingers of countless detectives and investigators. His ability to remain hidden in plain sight was nothing short of extraordinary. But by 2004, something had shifted. The very narcissism that had driven him to kill was about to become his undoing. The resurgence began with a newspaper article. The Wichita Eagle ran a feature story commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The piece speculated that BTK had either died or been imprisoned for other crimes. For most readers, it was simply a retrospective look at an old case. For Dennis Rader, it was a provocation he couldn't ignore. The article struck at the core of his identity. Here was his life's work, his carefully orchestrated reign of terror, being dismissed as ancient history. The suggestion that he might be dead was particularly galling to a man who craved recognition and control. Rader had spent decades building the BTK persona, crafting letters, leaving clues, playing his twisted game with law enforcement. The thought of being forgotten was unbearable. In March 2004, Rader broke his silence. He sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle containing photographs of Vicky Vagerle, one of his victims from 1986. The package also included a photocopy of her driver's license, items that only the killer would possess. The message was clear. BTK was still alive, and he demanded attention. The media response was immediate and intense. News outlets across the country picked up the story. The BTK Killer was back, and Wichita was once again gripped by fear. But this time, law enforcement was ready. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, who had been studying the BTK case for years, assembled a task force specifically designed to catch the killer. What followed was a carefully orchestrated cat-and-mouse game. Rader, emboldened by the renewed attention, began sending a series of communications to various media outlets. He used cereal boxes to contain his materials, possibly a reference to the term serial killer. Inside these packages were drawings, crime scene photographs, written descriptions of his murders, and even dolls posed to mimic his victims' deaths. Each communication revealed more about the killer's psychology. Rader was methodical, organized, and deeply narcissistic. He signed his letters with elaborate symbols and took credit for murders that had gone unsolved for decades. He seemed to revel in the attention, describing his crimes in chilling detail while maintaining his facade of normalcy in his daily life. The investigation team, dubbed the Ghostbusters by local media, worked around the clock to analyze every piece of evidence. They employed cutting-edge forensic techniques, consulted with behavioral analysts, and carefully planned their public responses to keep Rader engaged. They knew that his need for attention was both his strength and his weakness. As the communications continued, Rader became increasingly bold. He sent packages to television stations, newspapers, and even left items around Wichita for authorities to find. Each interaction fed his ego, but it also provided investigators with more evidence to work with. They were slowly building a profile of their suspect, narrowing down the possibilities. The breakthrough came in January 2005, when Rader made a critical error. In one of his communications, he asked police whether they could trace a floppy disk if he sent one to them. The question revealed both his technological naivety and his growing desperation for more efficient communication methods. He was getting older, and the physical act of preparing elaborate packages was becoming cumbersome. Law enforcement saw an opportunity. Through a classified advertisement in the Wichita Eagle, they responded to his question with a carefully crafted lie. They assured him that a floppy disk would be safe and could not be traced back to him. It was a gamble, but they were betting on Rader's arrogance and his trust in their word. The plan worked perfectly. Rader sent a floppy disk to KSAS TV, a local television station. The disk contained a document titled Test A, Can You Hear Me Now? But hidden within the file's metadata was information that would seal his fate. The disk revealed that the document had been created by someone named Dennis and had been used on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. Computer forensics expert Randy Stone analyzed the disk and within minutes had identified the crucial details. A simple internet search revealed that Dennis Rader was the president of Christ Lutheran Church. After more than 3 decades of hunting, investigators finally had their suspect. The task force moved quickly but carefully. They needed to confirm that Dennis Rader was indeed BTK before making an arrest. The solution came through DNA evidence. Investigators learned that Rader's daughter, Carrie, had recently been treated at a local hospital. They obtained a sample of her DNA from medical waste and compared it to genetic material collected from BTK crime scenes decades earlier. The match was conclusive. Dennis Rader was BTK. On February 25, 2005, Rader was arrested while driving near his home in Park City. He was pulled over by multiple police vehicles in a carefully coordinated operation. The man who had terrorized Wichita for decades was finally in custody, and his reaction was telling. Rather than showing surprise or fear, Rader appeared almost relieved. The game was over, and in some twisted way, he had achieved the notoriety he had always craved. During his interrogation, Rader was cooperative and seemed to enjoy discussing his crimes. He expressed shock that police had lied to him about the floppy disk, but showed no remorse for his actions. Instead, he methodically walked investigators through each murder, providing details that only the killer could know. He corrected inaccuracies in police reports and seemed proud of his work. The confession was both comprehensive and chilling. Rader described his methods, his motivations, and his fantasies with clinical detachment. He explained how he had chosen his victims, how he had planned each attack, and how he had managed to avoid detection for so long. He spoke about his projects, his elaborate fantasies, and his need for control as if discussing a hobby. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. In a moment that shocked even seasoned observers, he was allowed to describe each of his crimes in detail. For hours, he spoke about his victims, his methods, and his motivations. He showed no emotion, no remorse, only a cold recitation of facts. It was a final performance for a man who had spent his life seeking attention. Judge Greg Waller sentenced Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his sentencing, so life imprisonment was the harshest punishment available. As he was led away in shackles, Rader's 30-year reign of terror was finally over. The BTK case became a landmark in criminal investigation, demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of forensic science. It showed how a methodical killer could evade capture for decades, but also how modern technology and persistent investigation could eventually bring even the most careful predator to justice. For the families of his victims, Rader's arrest, brought a measure of closure, though the pain of their losses would never fully heal. For law enforcement, it represented the successful conclusion of one of the longest-running serial killer investigations in American history, and for the community of Wichita, it marked the end of a nightmare that had haunted the city for a generation. Dennis Rader now sits in El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He has given few interviews and maintains correspondence with researchers and journalists, still seeking the attention that drove him to kill. His case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals who hope to understand how such evil can hide behind such an ordinary facade. The BTK Killer's story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can be our neighbors, our community leaders, the people we trust and respect. Dennis Rader's ability to compartmentalize his life, to be both a family man and a serial killer, challenges our understanding of human nature and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for evil that exists within seemingly normal people. By the late 1970s, the BTK Killer had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. The letters stopped coming, the murders ceased. The terror that had gripped Wichita for nearly a decade seemed to dissolve into the Kansas wind, leaving behind only cold case files and haunted memories. Most serial killers escalate until they're caught, but Dennis Rader was different. He simply stopped, and for 26 years, he remained a ghost. But Rader hadn't disappeared. He had simply learned to blend deeper into the fabric of ordinary life. While families across Wichita slowly began to heal, while detectives moved on to other cases, while the city tried to forget the nightmare that had stalked its streets, Dennis Rader was living among them, working beside them, serving them, all while carrying the weight of 10 murders and a hunger that never truly died. During this dormant period, Rader's public life flourished in ways that would seem impossible for a man who had committed such horrific acts. He climbed the ranks at AT&T Security, the very company that installed alarm systems in homes across Wichita. The irony was suffocating. Homeowners, many of whom had specifically requested security systems because they feared the BTK Killer, were unknowingly inviting that same killer into their homes to install their protection. Rader would walk through their houses, noting layouts, vulnerabilities, family routines. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the sheep were paying him to survey their flock. His work at ADT gave him access to detailed information about hundreds of homes. He knew which families had children, which houses had dogs, which security systems could be easily bypassed. He studied floor plans, noted escape routes, and cataloged potential victims. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the structured nature of his work life, or maybe it was the increasing demands of his growing family. His wife Paula had given birth to their daughter Carrie in 1978, and their son Brian followed in 1982. Rader found himself trapped between two worlds, the darkness that called to him and the mundane responsibilities of suburban fatherhood. The psychological pressure of maintaining this double life was immense, but Rader had developed coping mechanisms that allowed him to function. He created elaborate fantasy scenarios, dressing up dolls in clothing stolen from his victims and photographing them in bondage positions. He would cut pictures of women from magazines and create detailed scenarios of capture, torture, and death. These rituals became a pressure valve, allowing him to satisfy his urges without actually killing. He later described these activities as essential to his survival, claiming they enabled him to delay his next murder for months or even years. In 1979, Rader graduated from Wichita State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in administration of justice. The irony was not lost on him. He was studying the very system designed to catch killers like himself, learning about criminal psychology, forensic techniques, and law enforcement procedures. His professors had no idea they were teaching a serial killer how to better evade capture. Rader excelled in his studies, particularly in courses about criminal behavior and investigation techniques. He was learning from the inside how to stay one step ahead of those who might hunt him. By 1988, Rader had left ADT and was working various jobs around Wichita. He briefly worked for the U.S. Census Bureau, going door to door and entering homes across the city. Once again, he was granted intimate access to families and their routines, all under the guise of official government business. The position allowed him to case potential victims while maintaining his cover as a respectable civil servant. He knocked on doors, asked personal questions about family members, and noted details about home security. It was the perfect hunting ground, and he was paid to do it. But it was in 1991 that Rader accepted the position that would define his public persona for the next 14 years. He became a compliance officer for Park City, a small suburb just north of Wichita. In this role, he was responsible for enforcing city ordinances, measuring grass heights, citing residents for code violations, and generally maintaining the aesthetic standards of the community. It was a position that required him to be meticulous, authoritarian, and controlling. In other words, it was perfect for Dennis Rader. As the Park City compliance officer, Rader became known for his rigid enforcement of even the most minor infractions. He would prowl the streets with a measuring tape, citing homeowners whose grass was a fraction of an inch too tall. He issued warnings for improperly stored trash cans, unauthorized yard decorations, and vehicles parked in the wrong spots. Residents described him as petty, vindictive, and obsessed with control. They had no idea how accurate that assessment truly was. The job satisfied Rader's need for dominance in a socially acceptable way. He could exercise power over his neighbors, enter their property at will, and enforce his vision of order upon the community. When residents complained about his heavy-handed tactics, Rader would respond with cold bureaucratic efficiency. He kept detailed records of every violation, every complaint, every interaction. His files were immaculate, his procedures flawless. He was the perfect government employee, if you ignored the fact that he was also a serial killer. During this period, Rader also became increasingly involved in his church. He served as a deacon at Christ Lutheran Church, taught Sunday school, and was eventually elected as president of the church council. He organized youth activities, participated in community service projects, and was seen as a pillar of the congregation. Parents trusted him with their children. Church members looked to him for spiritual guidance. He was living a complete double life, and he was extraordinarily good at it. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain these dual identities was staggering. During the day, Rader would cite residents for minor infractions with the same methodical precision he had once used to plan murders. On Sundays, he would stand before his congregation and speak about morality, redemption, and the importance of following God's commandments. At night, he would retreat to his private fantasies, reliving his kills and planning future murders. He had created separate mental boxes for each aspect of his life, and he could move between them seamlessly. But even during this dormant period, Rader wasn't completely inactive. In 1985, he committed what would be his 9th murder, killing Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old neighbor who lived just a few blocks from his house. He strangled her in her bedroom, then took her body to his church, where he photographed her in various bondage positions. The symbolism was deeply disturbing. He was defiling both his victim and his place of worship, merging his religious life with his murderous impulses in the most grotesque way possible. The Hedge murder demonstrated that Rader's skills hadn't diminished during his years of inactivity. He was still methodical, still careful, still able to kill without leaving evidence. But it also showed that his psychological needs were evolving. Taking the body to his church wasn't just about convenience or privacy. It was about power, about demonstrating his complete dominance over both the sacred and the profane. He was literally getting away with murder in the house of God. His next victim came in 1986. Vicky Vegerla, a 28-year-old mother of two, was strangled in her home while her children were at school. Rader posed as a telephone repairman to gain entry, then attacked her when she was alone. He took her driver's license as a trophy and photographed her body before leaving. The murder was clean, efficient, and seemingly motiveless. Police had no suspects, no leads, no evidence. Rader had struck again and vanished back into his ordinary life. The final known murder occurred in 1991. Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman, was killed in her secluded home. Rader bound her with pantyhose and strangled her, then dumped her body under a bridge. He kept her driver's license and personal items as trophies, adding them to his growing collection of souvenirs. It was a fitting end to his killing spree, brutal and calculated, leaving no trace of his identity. After the Davis murder, Rader seemed to enter a state of complete dormancy. He focused on his job, his family, and his church activities. He coached youth baseball, participated in community events, and maintained his reputation as a model citizen. But beneath the surface, the darkness remained. He continued his fantasy rituals, continued to scout potential victims, continued to plan murders that he never carried out. He later claimed that he had identified an 11th victim in 2004, but was prevented from acting by construction workers who were unexpectedly present at the scene. The length of Rader's dormant period was unprecedented in the annals of serial killing. Most killers escalate until they're caught, but Rader demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to control his urges. He attributed this to his active fantasy life, his stable employment, and his family responsibilities. But perhaps the real reason was simpler. He was having too much fun playing his role as a respectable citizen. The game of deception had become as thrilling as the murders themselves. The quiet suburban home at 6220 North Independence Street in Park City, Kansas, sat like any other on a Tuesday morning in February 2005. The neighbor's dog barked, children walked to school, and the morning routine felt perfectly ordinary. But what unfolded that day would shock a community that had lived in fear for over 3 decades. The man they pulled over in his white Jeep Cherokee wasn't some shadowy figure from the night. He was Dennis Rader, 60 years old, church council president, compliance officer, and the father of 2 grown children. He was also BTK. The arrest came after what can only be described as a catastrophic miscalculation. For someone who had managed to evade capture for over 30 years, who had studied criminal justice and understood police procedures, the mistake was almost laughably simple: a floppy disk. In an age when technology was rapidly advancing, Dennis Rader made the fatal error of trusting law enforcement when they told him a computer disk couldn't be traced back to him. The investigation that led to his capture had been methodical and relentless. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr and his team had spent years building a profile, analyzing evidence, and waiting for BTK to make a mistake. When the 30-year anniversary of the Otero murders approached in 2004, local media began running stories questioning whether the killer was still alive. This was exactly the kind of attention Dennis Rader craved, and it proved to be the catalyst that brought him out of hiding. The first sign of his return came in March 2004, when the Wichita Eagle received a letter containing photographs of Vicky Vegerla, the woman murdered in 1986. The package also included a photocopy of her driver's license, items that only the killer would have possessed. The letter was signed with the familiar BTK signature, and suddenly a case that had been dormant for over a decade was thrust back into the spotlight. What followed was a bizarre game of cat and mouse that played out in the media. Rader sent packages to television stations, newspapers, and even left items in public places around Wichita. He used cereal boxes as containers, a macabre play on the term serial killer. Inside these packages were photographs of victims, dolls posed to recreate the murder scenes, and detailed written accounts of his crimes. He was reliving his murders, but more than that, he was desperate for recognition. The communications revealed a man who had been consumed by his need for attention and control. In one letter, he asked police to acknowledge his communications by placing an ad in the newspaper. When they complied, it only emboldened him further. He began requesting specific responses, treating the entire situation like a game where he held all the cards. But his arrogance was building toward his downfall. The fatal mistake came in January 2005, when Rader sent a letter asking if a floppy disk could be traced back to him if he used it to send a message. The police, recognizing this as their best opportunity to catch him, responded through a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle, falsely assuring him that a disk would be safe to use. Rader, believing he could trust their response, sent the disc to KSAS television station. What happened next was a masterclass in digital forensics. The disc contained a deleted Microsoft Word document, and when investigators examined the metadata, they found crucial information. The document had been created by someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. A simple internet search revealed that Dennis Rader was the president of that church's congregation. After 30 years of hunting, they had their suspect. But digital evidence wasn't enough for a conviction. The team needed DNA confirmation, and they got it through a brilliant, investigative strategy. Rather than approach Rader directly, which might have spooked him, they obtained a sample of his daughter's DNA from a medical procedure. When they compared it to the DNA evidence collected from the original crime scenes, they had their match. The genetic evidence that had been carefully preserved for over 30 years finally had a name to go with it. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Rader was driving home for lunch when he noticed police cars following him. When they pulled him over, he didn't resist. He didn't try to run. He simply sat in the back of the police car with a slight smile on his face, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. In many ways, he had. The constant communication with police, the increasingly bold packages, the willingness to take risks for attention, all pointed to a man who was subconsciously engineering his own capture. During the interrogation, Rader displayed the same chilling calm that had characterized his crimes. He didn't deny his involvement. He didn't demand a lawyer. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to finally be able to discuss his crimes openly. What emerged was a detailed confession that provided answers to questions that had haunted investigators for decades. Rader walked investigators through each murder with mechanical precision. He described his planning process, his methods of entry, the specific ways he bound and killed his victims. He talked about the items he had taken from crime scenes and how he had used them in his fantasies over the years. He showed no remorse, no emotion, just a clinical recounting of 30 years of violence. The confession revealed the extent of his psychological manipulation and control. He described how he would research his victims, learning their routines and vulnerabilities. He talked about the sexual fantasies that drove him and how he would use items taken from victims to relive the murders. He explained his long periods of dormancy, how family and work obligations would sometimes interfere with his killing, and how he would use autoerotic activities to satisfy his urges during these periods. Perhaps most chilling was his matter of fact discussion of potential future victims. He revealed that he had been planning an 11th murder when he was arrested, that he had identified a target and was in the process of stalking her. He talked about his retirement fantasies, including plans to convert a grain silo into a private torture chamber. At 60 years old, Dennis Rader had no intention of stopping. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including DNA, digital forensics, and his own confession, Rader chose to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. On August 18, 2005, he stood before Judge Gregory Waller and methodically pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing provided victims' families with their first opportunity to directly address the man who had destroyed their lives. One by one, they stood and spoke about the pain he had caused, the decades of fear and uncertainty, the loved ones who had died without ever knowing who had killed their family members. Through it all, Dennis Rader sat expressionless, occasionally taking notes, showing no sign of remorse or emotion. When given the opportunity to address the court, Rader's statement was as disturbing as his crimes. He talked about his victims in clinical terms, describing them as projects and referring to his murders as taking them down. He showed no genuine remorse, instead offering what sounded like a rehearsed apology that focused more on his own suffering than that of his victims' families. Judge Waller sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kansas had reinstated the death penalty in 1994, but since Rader's crimes had been committed before that date, life imprisonment was the harshest sentence available. He was transported to El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he remains today. The capture of BTK marked the end of one of the longest-running serial killer investigations in American history. It was a case that had consumed multiple generations of investigators, terrorized a community for 3 decades, and demonstrated both the persistence of evil and the power of modern investigative techniques. The combination of traditional detective work, advancing forensic science, and the killer's own psychological compulsions had finally brought justice to the families of his victims. But even with Dennis Rader behind bars, questions remained. How many other potential victims had he stalked but never attacked? What other crimes might he have committed during his decades of activity? And perhaps most troubling, how many other individuals like him were living double lives in communities across America, hiding their true nature behind facades of respectability and normalcy? The BTK case serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lives next door, attends the same church, works in the same office. Dennis Rader spent 30 years proving that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal, most trustworthy, most integrated into the fabric of society. His story is a testament to the complexity of human nature and the disturbing reality that monsters can hide in plain sight. The spring of 2004 marked a turning point in the BTK investigation. For nearly 30 years, the case had remained dormant, gathering dust in filing cabinets, while Dennis Rader continued his ordinary life in Park City, Kansas. But something about the approaching 30th anniversary of the Otero murders stirred something deep within him. The local media began running retrospective pieces about the unsolved BTK killings, speculating whether the killer had died, moved away, or simply stopped killing. For a man driven by an insatiable need for attention and control, this was unbearable. Rader couldn't stand the idea that people might forget about BTK, the killer identity he had crafted so carefully. The fear he had instilled in Wichita, the elaborate game of cat and mouse he had played with authorities, all of it was fading from public consciousness. This wasn't just about ego, though. That certainly played a role. For Rader, BTK wasn't just something he had done, it was who he was at his core. The murders, the letters, the taunting communications, they were all part of an elaborate performance designed to showcase his superiority over law enforcement and his power over life and death. So in March 2004, after decades of silence, Dennis Rader decided to resurface. We see he sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper, along with a photocopy of victim Vicki Wegerle's driver's license and 3 photographs of her body. The message was clear. BTK was back, and he wanted the world to know it. The police immediately recognized the authenticity of the communication. The details were too specific, too accurate to be the work of a copycat. After all these years, the real BTK Killer was reaching out again. What followed was a year-long communication spree that would ultimately lead to Rader's downfall. Between March 2004 and February 2005, he sent numerous packages to media outlets and law enforcement. These weren't random acts of desperation, they were calculated moves in what Rader believed was a sophisticated game of psychological warfare. He sent dolls posed to mimic his victims, detailed drawings of his crimes, and even a word puzzle where he spelled out his name. Each communication was designed to demonstrate his intelligence, his attention to detail, and his belief that he was smarter than everyone trying to catch him. The police, led by Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, approached this new development with a mixture of excitement and caution. They knew they were dealing with someone who had successfully evaded capture for 3 decades. But they also recognized that Rader's need for attention might be his weakness. Every communication was an opportunity to gather evidence, to learn more about the killer's psychology, and potentially to trick him into making a mistake. The investigators began responding to BTK's communications through the media, creating a dialogue that played directly into Rader's narcissistic tendencies. They would publish responses in newspapers or make statements on television, knowing that Rader was watching and would likely respond. This psychological chess match continued for months, with each side trying to gain an advantage over the other. Rader's communications revealed disturbing details about his crimes and his mindset. He described his victims with clinical detachment, referring to them by numbers rather than names. He detailed his methods of binding and torturing them, showing no remorse or recognition of their humanity. In one particularly chilling communication, he included a detailed drawing of how he had bound and killed 11-year-old Josephine Otero, complete with annotations describing the ligature marks and the positioning of her body. But perhaps most revealing were the insights these communications provided into Rader's psychology. He clearly viewed himself as a criminal mastermind, someone who had outsmarted the entire criminal justice system. He took pride in his ability to compartmentalize his life, to be both a family man and a serial killer. In his twisted worldview, this made him superior to other criminals who couldn't maintain such elaborate deceptions. The communications also revealed Rader's deep need for recognition and his frustration with being forgotten. He complained about the lack of media attention his crimes had received compared to other serial killers. He wanted to be remembered alongside famous killers like Jack the Ripper and the son of Sam. This wasn't just about getting away with murder. It was about achieving a kind of immortality through infamy. As the communications continued, the police began to notice patterns in Rader's behavior. He was methodical and careful, but he was also arrogant. He seemed to genuinely believe that he was too smart to be caught, that his decades of successful evasion proved his intellectual superiority. This arrogance would prove to be his undoing. The breakthrough came when Rader made a seemingly innocent inquiry. In one of his communications, he asked the police whether they could trace information from a floppy disk if he sent one. The police, recognizing an opportunity, responded through a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle, falsely assuring him that such a disk could not be traced. It was a lie, but it was exactly what Rader wanted to hear. Believing that he was safe, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to KSAS television station in February 2005. The disk contained a message about checking an index card for more information, but more importantly, it contained metadata that would seal his fate. When computer specialist Randy Stone examined the disk, he found that it had been used on a computer registered to someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. Within hours, investigators had identified Dennis Rader as the president of Christ Lutheran Church. A quick background check revealed that he was a compliance officer in Park City, had worked for ADT Security Services, and had studied criminal justice at Wichita State University. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the police needed more than circumstantial evidence to make an arrest. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Investigators learned that Rader's daughter, Carrie, had recently undergone a medical procedure at a local hospital. They obtained a sample of her DNA and compared it to genetic material that had been preserved from the 1974 Otero crime scene. The match was perfect. After 31 years, they finally had scientific proof of BTK's identity. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested outside his home in Park City. He was heading home for lunch when police cars surrounded his vehicle. The man who had terrorized Wichita for decades, who had taunted police and media with his elaborate communications, was taken into custody without incident. He seemed almost surprised that the police had managed to trace the floppy disk back to him, despite their assurance that it couldn't be done. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors, church members, and co-workers struggled to reconcile the Dennis Rader they knew with the brutal killer he had been revealed to be. He was the guy who complained about barking dogs and enforced city ordinances. He was the church president who helped organize community events. He was the father who attended his children's school functions. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. After his arrest, Dennis Rader's facade finally crumbled. The man who had spent decades masquerading as a pillar of the community, the devoted family man, the helpful neighbor, was revealed to be something far more sinister. But what made his confession so chilling wasn't just the crimes he admitted to. It was the casual, almost mundane way he described them, as if he were reading from a grocery list rather than recounting the systematic torture and murder of 10 innocent people. In the interrogation room, Rader displayed the same eerie calm that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for so long. He didn't break down. He didn't show remorse. Instead, he seemed almost relieved, as if the weight of his double life had finally been lifted. Detective Ken Landwehr, who had pursued BTK for years, later described the experience as deeply unsettling. Here was a man who spoke about binding, torturing, and killing human beings with the same detached professionalism he might have used to discuss municipal code violations. The confession itself was methodical and thorough. Rader walked investigators through each murder in excruciating detail, correcting them when they got facts wrong, filling in gaps that had haunted the investigation for decades. He described how he had stalked his victims, how he had planned each attack, how he had gained entry to their homes. He talked about the items he had stolen, the photographs he had taken, the elaborate fantasy scenarios he had constructed around each killing. What emerged from these sessions was a portrait of a man who had compartmentalized his life with frightening efficiency. During the day, he was Dennis Rader, compliance officer, church leader, scoutmaster. At night, in the privacy of his own mind, he was BTK, reliving his crimes through the trophies he had collected, the photographs he had taken, the detailed notes he had written. He described how he would dress up dolls in his victims' clothing, how he would create elaborate bondage scenarios, how he would masturbate while looking at crime scene photographs. The psychological evaluation that followed painted a picture of a man who exhibited classic signs of psychopathy. Dr. Robert Mendoza, one of the forensic psychologists who examined Rader, noted his complete lack of empathy, his grandiose sense of self-worth, his manipulative behavior, and his superficial charm. Rader showed no genuine remorse for his actions, no real understanding of the pain he had caused. When asked about his victims' families, he seemed genuinely puzzled by the question, as if their suffering was an irrelevant detail. Perhaps most disturbing was Rader's explanation of his motivations. He spoke of Factor X, this mysterious force that he claimed drove him to kill. But as the interviews continued, it became clear that Factor X was simply Rader's way of avoiding responsibility for his choices. He had created this elaborate mythology around his crimes, casting himself as the unwilling vessel for some dark supernatural force, when in reality he was simply a man who had chosen to act on his most violent impulses. The impact of Rader's confession extended far beyond the courtroom. For the families of his victims, it provided answers to questions that had haunted them for decades, but it also forced them to confront the full horror of what their loved ones had endured. The Otero family, whose 4 members had been BTK's first known victims, finally learned the details of what had happened on that terrible day in January 1974. The knowledge was both a blessing and a curse. The community of Wichita struggled to process the revelation that their neighbor, their fellow church member, their city employee had been responsible for the reign of terror that had gripped their city for so long. How had they missed the signs? How had someone so deeply embedded in their community managed to hide such a dark secret? The answer, experts suggested, lay in Rader's exceptional ability to compartmentalize his life and his understanding of how to blend into society. During his confession, Rader also revealed the extent of his communications with law enforcement and the media. He had written dozens of letters over the years, many of which had never been made public. He had sent packages containing victims' belongings, crime scene photographs, and elaborate drawings. He had even created a symbol for himself, a twisted logo that he would include in his communications. All of this was part of his need for recognition, his desire to be known and feared. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and his own detailed confession, Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his trial, so he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a fate that seemed almost anticlimactic given the decades of terror he had inflicted. But even in prison, Rader continued to seek attention and control. He granted interviews to journalists and researchers, always presenting himself as a cooperative subject while subtly trying to manipulate the narrative. He wrote letters to victims' families, ostensibly to apologize, but often containing details that seemed designed to cause additional pain. He created artwork and poetry, much of it reflecting his continued obsession with bondage and violence. The case of Dennis Rader forced a fundamental reckoning with our understanding of evil. Here was not a monster lurking in the shadows, but a man who had successfully integrated himself into society while harboring the darkest of secrets. He had been a husband, a father, a community leader. He had enforced city ordinances, served on church committees, helped his neighbors with their problems. The revelation that such a person could also be capable of such horrific acts challenged our most basic assumptions about human nature. Criminologists and psychologists continue to study the BTK case, seeking to understand how someone can maintain such a convincing facade for so long. Rader's ability to compartmentalize his life, to separate his public persona from his private obsessions, represents one of the most extreme examples of this psychological phenomenon on record. His case has contributed to our understanding of psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, and the ways in which serial killers can hide in plain sight. The story of Dennis Rader serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, attends church regularly, and helps old ladies cross the street. Sometimes it lives next door, waves good morning, and offers to help with yard work. The most dangerous predators are often those who understand how to blend in, how to appear normal, how to earn trust and respect while harboring the most twisted fantasies. In the end, Dennis Rader's downfall came not from superior detective work or advancing forensic science, but from his own narcissistic need for attention and recognition. His arrogance, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else, his compulsive need to communicate with law enforcement and the media ultimately led to his capture. The same personality traits that had allowed him to kill with impunity for decades also ensured his eventual destruction. Today, Dennis Rader sits in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, a 78-year-old man who will never again walk free. His victims remain dead, their families forever scarred by his actions. The community of Wichita has moved on, but the shadow of BTK still lingers. His case stands as a testament to the capacity for evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary facade, and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we never see coming. The arrest of Dennis Rader in February 2005 marked the end of one of America's most chilling criminal cases, but it also opened a window into the mind of a killer that continues to fascinate and horrify criminologists, psychologists, and the public to this day. The man who had terrorized Wichita for over 3 decades was finally in custody, and the world would soon learn the full extent of his depravity. During his interrogation, Rader displayed the same cold, methodical demeanor that had characterized his crimes. He showed no remorse, no emotion, and spoke of his victims as if they were merely objects in his twisted game. Detective Randy Stone, who conducted much of the interrogation, later described how Rader seemed almost relieved to finally be able to discuss his crimes openly. For 30 years, he had been forced to keep his greatest achievement, as he saw it, secret from the world. Now, finally, he could bask in the attention he had always craved. The confession that followed was both comprehensive and chilling. Rader provided detailed accounts of each murder, describing his methods, his motivations, and his feelings during and after each killing. He spoke of how he had stalked his victims, sometimes for months, learning their routines and planning the perfect moment to strike. He described the sexual gratification he derived from the act of killing and the control he felt over his victims' final moments. Perhaps most disturbing was Rader's complete lack of empathy for his victims or their families. When asked about the impact of his crimes, he responded with clinical detachment, as if discussing a scientific experiment rather than the brutal murder of innocent people. This absence of human emotion, this complete disconnection from the suffering he had caused, provided a rare glimpse into the mind of a true psychopath. The psychological profile that emerged from Rader's confession and subsequent interviews painted a picture of a man driven by an insatiable need for power and control. His childhood fascination with bondage and torture had evolved into something far more sinister, a compulsion that could only be satisfied through the ultimate act of dominance, taking another person's life. The ritualistic nature of his crimes, the careful planning, and the collection of trophies all pointed to a killer who derived as much pleasure from the process as from the act itself. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who corresponded with Rader extensively after his arrest, noted that he displayed all the classic characteristics of a psychopathic personality. His grandiose sense of self-worth, his belief that he was superior to law enforcement and society in general, and his complete inability to form genuine emotional connections with others all fit the profile perfectly. Yet what made Rader particularly dangerous was his ability to function normally in society, to maintain relationships and hold positions of responsibility while harboring these dark impulses. The impact of Rader's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The families of those he killed were forced to relive their trauma during the trial, listening as he described in graphic detail how their loved ones had died. The community of Wichita, which had lived in fear for so long, struggled to come to terms with the fact that their tormentor had been hiding in plain sight, serving on the church council, enforcing city ordinances, and participating in community events. The trial itself was a media circus, with reporters and spectators packing the courthouse to hear Rader's confession. His demeanor throughout the proceedings was unsettling, almost businesslike, as he methodically described each murder with the same tone one might use to read a grocery list. When asked by the judge if he had killed these people, Rader replied simply, "Yes, sir, I have." There was no emotion, no hint of remorse, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his crimes. The families of his victims were given the opportunity to address Rader during the sentencing phase of the trial. Their statements were heart-wrenching, filled with pain, anger, and a desperate need for answers that Rader could never provide. Some spoke of how his crimes had destroyed their families, how they had never been able to move on from the trauma. Others expressed their anger at his audacity, his arrogance, and his complete lack of humanity. Rader, for his part, seemed almost bored by these emotional outpourings. He sat stoically, occasionally adjusting his glasses or shifting in his seat, but showing no sign that the words were having any impact on him. This cold indifference was perhaps more chilling than any display of emotion might have been. It confirmed what many had suspected, that Dennis Rader was a man completely devoid of human empathy, a predator who saw other people as nothing more than objects to be used for his own gratification. The sentence, when it came, was inevitable. Kansas had no death penalty during the time of Rader's crimes, so he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, a fitting end for a man who had taken so much from so many. As he was led away in shackles, Rader showed no emotion, no regret, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. He had finally achieved the notoriety he had always craved, but at the cost of his freedom and any chance of redemption. The investigation into Rader's crimes also revealed the extent to which he had been planning future murders. Police found detailed surveillance notes on potential victims, photographs of women he had been stalking, and elaborate fantasies about crimes he had yet to commit. It became clear that his arrest had likely prevented additional murders, that there were people walking around Wichita who had no idea how close they had come to becoming his next victims. The role of technology in Rader's capture cannot be overstated. His decision to communicate with police via computer disk was born of the same arrogance that had driven him to taunt authorities for so many years. He believed he was smarter than the police, that he could continue to play his game without consequence. The irony is that the very technology he thought would protect him ultimately led to his downfall. The metadata embedded in that Microsoft Word document provided the crucial link that investigators needed to identify him. This case also highlighted the importance of cold case investigations and the value of never giving up on unsolved crimes. The BTK task force had been working on these cases for decades, following up on leads, re-examining evidence, and waiting for the breakthrough that would finally bring the killer to justice. When Rader began communicating again in 2004, they were ready. Their persistence and dedication ensured that when he finally made his mistake, they were there to catch him. The psychological impact of the BTK case extends beyond the immediate victims and their families. It serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary people. Rader's ability to maintain his facade for so long, to function as a husband, father, and community member while secretly planning and executing murders, challenges our assumptions about what a killer looks like. This case also contributed significantly to our understanding of serial killers and their motivations. Rader's detailed confessions provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the mind of a psychopathic killer. His writings, both during his active period and from prison, have been studied extensively by criminologists and psychologists seeking to understand what drives someone to commit such heinous acts. The media coverage of the BTK case was extensive and often sensationalized, raising questions about the responsibility of journalists when covering such crimes. The attention given to Rader's story arguably fed into his narcissistic need for recognition, giving him the platform he had always craved. This raises difficult questions about how society should respond to such individuals, and whether extensive media coverage might actually encourage other potential killers. The families of Rader's victims have struggled with the ongoing attention his case continues to receive. Books, documentaries, and television shows have been produced about the BTK killer, each one forcing the survivors to relive their trauma. While some have found value in sharing their stories, others have expressed frustration at the continued focus on Rader and his crimes. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Rader had been influenced by other serial killers. He had studied the cases of Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and others, learning from their methods and, crucially, from their mistakes. This copycat element adds another layer to his crimes, showing how the glorification of serial killers in popular culture can have real-world consequences. The security measures implemented in response to Rader's crimes changed how many people in Wichita lived their daily lives. Home security systems became more common, people became more cautious about their daily routines, and the sense of safety that had once characterized the community was forever altered. Even after his arrest, many residents found it difficult to shake the fear that had gripped them for so long. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement when dealing with serial killers. The BTK investigation spanned multiple decades and involved hundreds of officers, thousands of pieces of evidence, and countless hours of painstaking detective work. The resource allocation required for such cases is enormous, and the psychological toll on the investigators cannot be underestimated. As we look back on the BTK case today, it serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, both in our communities and in our justice system. Dennis Rader was able to kill for 30 years because he understood how to blend in, how to appear normal while harboring the darkest of impulses. His case, teaches us that evil can wear a familiar face, that monsters can hide behind badges and church positions and family photographs. The story of Dennis Rader is ultimately a story about the duality of human nature, about the capacity for both good and evil that exists within our society. It reminds us that we must remain vigilant, that we must pay attention to the warning signs, and that we must never become complacent in our efforts to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. Today, Dennis Rader remains in prison, serving his 10 life sentences in solitary confinement. He continues to seek attention through letters and interviews, still craving the recognition that drove him to kill. But his story serves as more than just a cautionary tale. It stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who never gave up, to the resilience of a community that refused to be broken by fear, and to the importance of justice, no matter how long it takes to achieve. The BTK case will continue to be studied and analyzed for years to come, providing valuable insights into the criminal mind and the investigative process. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder that behind every statistic, every case file, and every headline, there are real people whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. The true legacy of this case should not be the infamy of Dennis Rader, but the memory of his victims and the determination of those who brought him to justice.